Thank you for viewing this American Sewing Guild educational series on the basics of a bound seam finish. A bound seam finish encases the edges of seam allowances to prevent raveling and provides a beautiful finish for unlined garments. Unlike the Hong Kong seam finish, this seam finish does add a bit more bulk to the seam finish. A bound seam finish would work well for shirts, jackets, or coats which are unlined and where the fabric is about a medium to heavy weight. This seam finish would not be best on lightweight fabrics as the weight of the additional binding will outweigh the seam allowance. Do not use this seam finish on see-through fabrics as the seam finish will show through to the right side. To create a bound seam, sew a plain seam, meld the stitches, and press the seam allowance open. Each cut edge of the seam allowance will be bound. Cut a piece of lightweight fabric on the bias. Fabrics that work good for this type of seam finish include silk or lightweight cottons or polyester. Cut the bias, the length of the seam allowance, plus a couple of inches and approximately 1 to 1 1/4 inches wide. Test the seam finish before cutting the final width for the actual project. The thickness of the fashion fabric, as well as the thickness of the fabric used for the binding strip, affects the finished cut width of the bias binding. Working with a single seam allowance, place the right side of the binding face down to the right side of the seam allowance, matching cut edges. Sew a scant 1/4 inch from the cut edge. Meld the stitches, then press the bias fabric up toward the cut edge. Be careful when pressing so the bias edge will not stretch. Next, fold the remaining cut edge of the bias almost to, but not touching, the cut edge of the seam allowance. Press and fold the entire length of the seam allowance. Now press the folded edge up to just cover the first stitching. The other line of stitching is the actual seam line stitching. The folded edge should just cover the stitching. The bias bound edge is now ready for the last step. With the seam allowance facing up, stitch in the ditch or edge stitch through the bias through all layers. Let's watch how this is done. Use a regular stitch length or slightly longer if the fabrics are thicker, and use the inside edge of the toe of the presser foot as a guide for stitching in the ditch or edge stitching the bias to the seam allowance. Here's the stitching from the right side and from the back side of the seam allowance. Repeat the steps for the other side. Be sure to finish all edges before they are crossed with the next seams. Give the seam finish a final press, and the edges should be smooth with no ripples or pulling in the bias. From the right side of the fabric, the seam will look just like a plain seam. Thank you for viewing this American Sewing Guild video. If you have any questions, email ramona@asg.org. The American Sewing Guild is a national nonprofit organization dedicated to people who believe sewing is a rewarding and creative activity. If you enjoyed this video, join ASG to view our in-depth library of educational videos on various sewing topics. They are free to our members. Members also enjoy discounts from vendors who support our organization, along with many other benefits.